our first speaker, Bernice Redley. Bernice is a registered nurse and healthcare researcher with over 30 years' experience. She's a nurse, as we said, nurse researcher, academic, and has a partnership between Deakin University and Monash Health, Victoria. So without further ado, can I introduce Bernice?
I don't know if I need these on or off, but let's just see how we go. Thanks for the opportunity to present this research to you today. This is research is actually, it was a bit of an opportunity that was a collaboration with some architects, and we heard John in the previous session talking about user-centred design, and that's essentially the approach that we took for this research. So I'm just going to give you an overview of it. There's a full report available, it's online. But my contribution to this was as a clinician, as an emergency nurse, and it's amazing how it's shaped and provided some really unique insights into some of the ways that people communicate in emergency departments. So, as I mentioned, we used a user-centred design approach, and we had multiple stages in terms of how we went about this research, and it's a little bit different working with architects, I must say. So they come up with really good slides, and this really was about informing some future work. So this particular piece of work actually was used to inform a greenfield development site in the UK, and is also now sort of being filtered through lots of different mechanisms. And so really it was primary research, and the particular focus was on the emergency department staff. So we know about miscommunication. We know it's a huge factor related to teamwork, related to sentinel events and medical errors, nursing errors, and it's a huge issue. In particular, this research set out to look at the ways that informal communication, interprofessional communication occurred in the emergency department, and what are some of the factors about the environment that actually impact the way that clinicians communicate with each other within the emergency department, which is a particular interest of mine. The other thing is that we know, from our own experience, my own experience being in the emergency department, confidentiality, we're very mindful of confidentiality, but it's a very busy, very public environment, and whether often inadvertently confidentiality is often breached. So this particular piece of work was to look at design elements in the emergency department that enable or inhibit effective informal staff communication. So we very specifically didn't look at the patient component of this. We feel that had been done. A lot of work around design in hospital environments is very much about the patient, and what we were really interested in is what are the design features that actually impact on how staff communicate with each other. And we specifically looked at away from the patient bedside, so in collecting our data. So, and it really was about recognition that the ED is a workplace too. So yes, we do want to be very patient-centred, but in order to be patient-centred, we also need to create environments that make it easy for staff to do the right thing and to work effectively as a team. So it was a multi-method approach that we used. We started off with a sort of a brief literature review. I'm not going to talk about that in detail today. What I'm going to talk about are the findings, a bit about the method, but mainly about the findings of the research. We used an online social network survey, so we did a networking analysis, social network analysis of who do you communicate with around different aspects of informal communication and where does that occur in the emergency department. We used a method called photo elicitation, so this was actually a pretty cool way of getting insights into what people were thinking about how they communicate in different areas, and I'll show you some photos in a moment. And then we ran focus groups with 39 staff. So this occurred across 4 hospital sites, across 2 health networks in Victoria. So the method of photo elicitation essentially evolved inviting staff to go walk with them through the emergency department to take some photos of places that they thought were important to them for informal communication within the emergency department. And so we used an iPad, they took photos, and then we used those photos in the focus groups to then stimulate discussion. We also used innovative designs that came from the architects to stimulate thinking about what the possibilities might be. So what sorts of things would or and wouldn't work. So we had a combination of existing but also aspirational designs that we used to encourage exploration within the focus groups. So there were a couple of theoretical underpinnings involved with this research, and I'm actually going to talk about each of them and then in relation to the findings. So the first is Becker's 5 design principles for creating environments that support a culture of communication and collaboration. And so we actually looked at analysing the data both from the social network analysis, from the photos that the staff took, and also from the transcripts of the focus groups to look at these particular design principles and how well they worked in the emergency department. So the first was eco-diversity. So having lots of different types of workspaces actually stimulates people to interact with each other. What we found was that EDs have lots of different spaces, but often those spaces don't meet the needs that staff have, and staff are often required to adapt spaces, use them flexibly, and often for things that they weren't intended for. Yes, I can see lots of nodding heads. But in fact, staff like doing that too. So, which is sort of, I think, a trait of the emergency department is that we often, will be to the moment, reactive and also a bit proactive about just creating something that we need as a just-in-time. Spatial transparency is something that emerged as very important to emergency department staff, and that's really about being able to visualise and to see what's going on throughout the department and having a high degree of sort of visual connection with what's going on around you. And EDs performed very well, and as I said, this was very important. Functional inconvenience is about not making it so easy for people to be in their own little workspace. So functional inconvenience is about creating an environment that makes chance encounters with people on a day-to-day basis more frequent. And so the more frequent these informal interactions are, the more likely you are to have informal conversations and therefore stimulate opportunities for people to interact with each other. And EDs had a bit of a balance of this. So the next one is human scale, and I'll talk about that. But because EDs are often developed around particular functional areas, people move between those functional areas. So they have clinical areas designed around a specific or functional need of the ED, but the functional inconvenience occurs when people often move between those areas. So there's those chance interactions. Human scale is about creating those functional areas. So typically, EDs are very much developed nowadays into specific areas. There's a resus area, there's a triage area, there's workstations, there's paediatrics. And this was actually quite interesting when we were looking at sort of the functional areas of the emergency department, and then we started to analyse what people were saying about the conversations that they were having. A gap emerged in terms of functional areas, which was often about one of the patient groups that staff were most concerned about were those people that needed sort of high surveillance and low stimulation. And there really wasn't a functional area in EDs for particularly, for example, managing people with behavioural disturbances, whether they be sort of mental health related, older people who often need to have continuous surveillance, but not a lot of sort of environmental stimulation. Neutral zones are the areas that aren't owned by anybody. And so these are the areas such as your corridors and your treatment rooms and areas that aren't necessarily owned by a particular discipline or functional group. And these areas, again, stimulate sort of non-hierarchical relationships and interactions between people. So they're often meeting points, they're chance encounters that people actually have. So when we actually analysed the photos that people took, we identified that there were sort of 5 particular types of places where people communicate. And the first of those was sort of the central workstations, which were often the hub of the emergency department. These were very public areas. They weren't very good for conversations that maybe had a sensitive or a private nature. But they were also very important in terms of identifying areas where people could actually go to find somebody if they needed to have a particular conversation. The next area were the dedicated sort of spaces. So there were allied health officers and medication rooms and storerooms and relatives rooms. And these often had a particular function, and often that function was adapted for different uses. One of the things that really stood out for me was when we were running our focus groups was a comment from one of the nurses who said that essentially the medication room is a really important place for, in particular, what we called comfort talk. And so this nurse described that's the only place that they could actually go to sit down, because you could actually sit down, close the door, and no one could see you. And so, because if you were seen to be sitting down, you were considered not to be busy enough and not working hard enough. And so staff would go into these areas where they could hide, so they could actually have a conversation, a debrief, or even just sit down for 2 minutes, behind the little window, behind the shelf where nobody could see them, to actually get a bit of relief. Patient spaces, although we weren't weren't sort of emphasising patient spaces, we did identify that often conversations, they're not very good for sensitive conversations. Often, people would draw a curtain to have a private conversation, fully knowing that somebody on the other side can hear what's going on. And then there were the transit areas, your corridors, these neutral spaces, again, often used and very important in terms of those opportunistic communal areas, communal areas, not seen as very good for what we would call the comfort talk, because they weren't, again, very private for people, and often, a few people in there, so that very difficult for people to actually use those spaces. The other theoretical model that we used was Vischer's model of environmental comfort, and this is sort of a bit of a Maslow hierarchy. Now, a really interesting thing here is that down the bottom is sort of the physiological needs. So these are the needs of things like, having comfortable chairs, nice environment, somewhere to sit, somewhere to eat. What we actually discovered was this model doesn't actually fit that well in the emergency department, and in fact, we've probably tipped it on its head. ED staff are happy to compromise those basic functions, and in fact people were saying we don't want environments that have got comfy chairs and that they've nice environments and they're nice colours and outdoors, because we don't want people to be here too long, because we don't want them to be too comfortable. And it was a bit of a surprise for me to hear staff talking that way. And often this was the trade-off, because they were very much driven by this need for psychological comfort. They actually need to feel safe within their environment. And so often the places where they were communicating were about the places where they were actually feeling safe. And a lot of the informal communication was actually driven by these balancing of the tensions between sort of the functions of the ED and this need for sort of psychological safety, to feel in control, to feel that, that they know what's going on and that they can see what's happening and be able to respond. So we actually identified that there was this real tension between these three dimensions. So the findings really demonstrate there were sort of three key things to think about in terms of informal communication. The first is about safety. Staff need to feel safe, and that there's a difference between the safety for case talk, which is about talking about the patients and about patient care, and comfort talk, which is that need around the psychological sort of component of debriefing with each other, actually, feeling safe and having an opportunity to sort of sit down and take a breath. The need for connection, highly connected to other parts of the department. People wanted to have that high level of visual connection, but also that auditory sort of component. So there was sort of two levels of connection, and often there was also this need for privacy, which then was about, that need to be able to hide away and to be able to not necessarily be on show. So just some of the quotes from some of our participants around safety. And, this picture actually generated a lot of discussion because it's actually a row of clinicians with their backs to patients. And so the safety concerns around this actually were quite pronounced. The talk about, going somewhere private, having not just a door and a curtain, actually being physically not on show for other staff. And in fact, it was more important that other staff thought that they looked busy as opposed to patients, and families, but it came up for both. And then that connection. So we discovered that these areas, we could actually map them according to how confidential and how connected they were. And it sort of came up about the same time as some of these reports really that we've already seen in this conference. We found that staff sort of feel most unsafe in these areas which are actually very public. And about this case talk and comfort talk in places where they can do that. And we identified that there's actually an ideal space where maybe we need to be thinking about providing these sort of private multi-purpose spaces for staff to engage more in the comfort talk, but also that case talk. So our ED, we need to think about design to maximise our safety, the privacy and connection. And some recommendations that actually came out of this was around, how do we use things like glass and joinery, but also having technology. So we also found, people will have these informal conversations, but they actually don't have the opportunity to record those informal conversations about patient care, which often get lost. The relationship between the behaviours and the environment emerged as really important. This notion of actually, we don't want to have a comfortable environment actually contradicts a lot of the research that says that the environment actually influences how people behave. And, having an environment that is uncomfortable and very clinically focused actually can aggravate behaviours or, unintended behaviours and behaviours of concern. Oh, next one. So that's all. Thank you.